Rockingham County Reads would like to welcome you to our program tonight. My name is Martha Balsley. I'm currently president of Rockingham County Reads, but there's a wonderful committee, and so we're all presidents of it. We're so happy that Rockingham Community College is sponsoring this event tonight, and I'd also like to mention the Rockingham County Library. They are one of our sponsors, the Reedsville Human Relations Commission, and the Friends of the Library of all the libraries in Rockingham County. And if you are in any of those groups, if you're with the Friends or if you're in Rockingham County Reads, or you're representing the college in some way, or you're a student, a teacher, or whatever, or on the Human Relations Commission, just wave your hand so people will see. Okay, good. All right, good. So you can see who's here with that. We've had a lot of fun with Charles Dickens since September. A couple of us have gone into some of the elementary schools, and we have dressed in Victorian dress to the best of our ability and have read to third graders and second graders a book called A Boy Called Dickens, and it was just more fun. And you can imagine how cute the kids were and how they stared at us as we walked down the hall, and I felt real silly, but anyhow, it was fun. And we've had groups that have met at the various libraries. At Reedsville, we had a tea, and that was fun. And we have had several different activities going on, and we're so glad all of you are here tonight. I would like to tell you a little bit about Dr. Elliott Engel. Originally from Indianapolis, Indiana, he now lives in Raleigh, and he's taught at UNC and North Carolina State and Duke, and everybody can cheer for their teams here. He earned his MA and PhD at Woodrow Wilson Fellow, as a Woodrow Wilson Fellow at UCLA. While at UCLA, he won the university's Outstanding Teacher Award. Dr. Engel has written 10 books published in England, Japan, and the United States. And some of these books are A Dab of Dickens and a Touch of Twain. And then one called Raining Cats and Dogs, but raining is spelled Reigining. And another one, How Oscar Became Wild. His mini lecture series on Charles Dickens ran on PBS television stations around the country. His articles have appeared in numerous newspapers and national magazines, including Newsweek. He has lectured throughout the United States and on all the continents, including Antarctica. 4 plays which he has written have been produced in the last 10 years. For his scholarship and teaching, Dr. Engel has received North Carolina's Adult Education Award, North Carolina State Alumni Professorship, and Victorian Society's Award of Merit. Most recently, for his 30 years of academic work and service in promoting Charles Dickens, he was nominated and inducted into the Royal Society of Arts in England. Since 1980, Dr. Engel has been president of the Dickens Fellowship of North Carolina, the largest branch of this worldwide network of clubs. The sale of Dr. Engel's books, CDs, and DVDs have raised funds for the Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital, which Dickens helped found in London in 1852. Professor Engel continues to teach outside the classroom and give literary and historical programs throughout the world. He also presents assemblies at elementary, middle, and high schools, and his educational CDs are used in classrooms around the country. In his spare time, he enjoys reading, walking, and vacationing in exotic locations where he is not asked to deliver a lecture. And so I present Dr. Elliott Engel.
Thank you very much, Martha, for that wonderful introduction. I not only am delighted to be here tonight, but I am astonished that this many people turned up. Very few of you actually know me, so we've got to give Charles Dickens the credit. If Dickens can turn out this many people when the ACC basketball tournament is in full swing, that says more about him than almost any article or book I have read on this man. I really am in your debt for coming out tonight. I hope I will make it worth your while. This will not be long. It cannot possibly be dull when you're talking about Charles Dickens. I'm going to begin with something you already know about Charles Dickens. Other than William Shakespeare, he is the most recognized name in the entire history of literature in English. Only Shakespeare beats him, but the problem with Dickens is a problem people like Shakespeare don't have. The problem with Dickens, as I see it, is this. For 11 months out of the year, you can go about your business not having to think about him even once. And then suddenly, come December, you cannot avoid Charles Dickens. He tossed off A Christmas Carol in 5 weeks of a writing career that lasted almost 37 years. Yes, Christmas Carol is a wonderful story. More people have called it the greatest expression of the Christmas spirit in the English language than any other book that has ever been written. And who of us would argue? It is the #1 secular Christmas story. And if you are a North Carolinian, you should be very, very proud that no matter who draws up a list of the greatest Christmas stories, Dickens is always #1. But #2 is a writer who grew up not 40 minutes from here. O. Henry, we know him as William Sidney Porter. O. Henry's The Gift of the Magi comes in second to Dickens as the greatest Christmas story of all time, and he is just a bit down the road on 87, 40 West, and there you are, right where O. Henry spent more of his life than he lived any other place. But of course, this isn't about O. Henry, so let's get back to Dickens. Anyway, his problem is what he is known for in the world today is Christmas Carol. Now you can say, but wait a minute. Isn't this the same man who wrote Oliver Twist, Great Expectations, Tale of Two Cities? He wrote all of those. Along with Christmas Carol, those are 4 works that whether you've read them or not, everybody's heard of them. And they know they're by Dickens. And I mean, he was born 200 years ago last year. It is rather impressive. A man who's been dead over 130 years can be remembered for so many different works. If Dickens knew that in the year 2013 he was known for all those works, he would be absolutely disgusted. Because when Dickens was alive 150 years ago, he wrote 16 major works. And anybody who was literate in America or England knew all 16 equally well. When he was alive, he was known for all 16 of his works. Now it's 100 years later, we're left with just the few I mentioned. What has happened to Dickens? It is a sad story. He did write 16 works. Unluckily for him, all but 4 of them are 650 pages long or longer. You will be shocked to hear the names of the 4 books Dickens wrote that are less than 600 pages. They are Christmas Carol, Oliver Twist, Tale of Two Cities, Great Expectations. Today, we don't read the best of Dickens or the worst of Dickens. We read the least of Dickens. We pick up his book. If it's 600 pages, who has time for that? But if you read every book he ever wrote twice, you still wouldn't have a clue as to the greatness of Dickens, because it is a fact. Charles Dickens's life is far more fascinating than any book he ever wrote. And nobody knows about his life either. Now, there's an exception to that rule. There is a large group of freshmen at North Carolina State University or Duke or at UNC who know all about Charles Dickens because the computer put them in my freshman composition class. On the first day of my freshman composition class, I always announce I'm a Dickens expert. We will be doing Dickens in this section. My students don't even blink. They've all seen a late-night movie version of Christmas Carol and figure, what else is there to know about this particular writer? I wait 6 weeks, and then I announce that since I am a Dickens expert, we want to read a typical Dickens novel. And since the typical Dickens novel is over 650 pages, they won't be getting Christmas Carol or Great Expectations. Actually, for 11 years in a row at North Carolina State, I assigned the same novel to my freshmen. I always assign that neglected classic entitled The Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit, which is 957 pages long. Now, I'm not stupid. I assign it the day after drop-and-add day at my university when you can't get out of the class. You either pay a lot of money or you stay. My students stay. But even my fellow English professors at North Carolina State say that it is cruel and unusual punishment to assign a 950-page novel to freshmen at NC State where you can major in turf grass. It is a legitimate major at NC State. This is not a liberal arts bastion. This is NC State. I do not assign Martin Chuzzlewit because I am cruel. If any of you have ever taught English, either in elementary school, in middle school, in high school, at home school, you know why I assign Martin Chuzzlewit. I assign that novel because I know, and you know too, when you assign a novel to a student today, they probably don't read the novel, they read the Cliff Notes. But there are no Cliff Notes to The Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit because nobody's read it but me. They read every page because I give them a quiz every Monday on the 250 pages I assigned last week. There's no hope. They have to read the novel, they take the quiz, and only when they have finished the last word of Martin Chuzzlewit do I begin lecturing on Dickens because, of course, I feel my lecture will mean something more if they've read the novel. They finish Martin Chuzzlewit. The next Monday, I begin lecturing on Dickens, and in fact, I always open my first lecture with what I actually told you a few minutes ago. I always begin by saying Charles Dickens's life is far more fascinating than any book he ever wrote. And my students all look up at me with an expression that says, God, I hope so. Having slogged through the worst 900 pages known to man. But even if you like Dickens, and I assume you're here not because it's so cold outside, but because you actually like this man, you're going to be hard-pressed to ever say, after what I'm about to tell you, that Dickens's books are more influential than his life. What is the most interesting thing about Dickens to all my students? It's very simple. It is this. Charles Dickens earned $68 million as a writer. And that $68 million does make him the top grossing author of all time that we still study in class. Yes, there are trash writers who earn way more than $68 million, but they're never going to be read at the university and at high school and in junior high. Only Dickens earned $68 million and is regarded as a classic. Now, I always have a business major in a class who will say, well, but is that 68 in our money or in his money? As if it's just 68 million, what is that? And in actuality, the 68 million he earned was not in his money. That would be billions. It's what 68 million can buy today, but it is a fortune. How did he do it? Well, I can tell you this. At 23, Dickens was a nobody. At 24, his first novel had sold more copies than any novel that had ever been written. Now, even my slow students figure out something important must have happened to Dickens between the age of 23 and 24, and it did. And this is what it is. When Dickens was 23, he was a nobody, and he had a really bad job. He had taught himself shorthand so that he could sit in Parliament every day and write down every boring word of every boring speech of members of Parliament, because they had no way to transcribe this. There was no tape recorders back then. It would be reporters who would write down every word, they'd publish it in the newspaper, and you'd get to see what your representative was talking about in Parliament. It was terribly boring work, so boring that at night Dickens would wander the city and he would sketch. Now, he couldn't draw at all. He didn't sketch with a pencil. He sketched with a pen. What he would do, let's say, would be to walk up to a tree that was very near Piccadilly Circus in London. Everybody had already seen this tree. It was blown over by the wind because they had been there for decades and windstorms had blown it over, so it looked like a hunched over little old lady. Well, Dickens would write a 1,500-word sketch about how this famous tree looked like an old lady. Now, who would pay you for a sketch like this? Well, nobody would. But if you were an unknown like Dickens, you mailed it into your favorite magazine. If the magazine liked your sketch a lot, they published it in the magazine. Now, you never got any money for it, but you got to see your words in print. What you never saw in print was your name, because if you were a 23-year-old unknown like Charles Dickens and you got a sketch published, they made you make up a name. You had to come up with a false name, what we call a pseudonym, like O. Henry, William Sidney Porter, Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens. Dickens had to come up with a pen name to use because only great authors like Sir Walter Scott could use their actual name. Well, as some of you may know if you study Dickens, Dickens came up with one of the great pen names in literature. As some of you know, he decided to call himself Boz, B-O-Z. And when you hear where he got the name Boz, you will appreciate his imagination. Dickens actually stole the name Boz from his youngest brother. Dickens was the second youngest member of his family, but he had a younger brother, a way younger brother, who was 17 years younger than Dickens, mistake-type younger when he came along in his parents' middle age. Now, if you know a mistake, or if you yourself happen to be a mistake, and we know some of you are because it turns out 1 out of 11 people are actually born long after their parents thought they were finished having kids. So if you come along really late in your family when no one really expected you, the one good thing about being born late like Dickens's brother, you are invariably precocious, because not only are your parents adults as you were growing up, your brothers and sisters are virtually adults because they're so much older. So when you start talking, anything you say is deemed adorable. Everybody thinks you're just so cute that you become precocious. Well, Dickens's youngest brother was no exception. He was so cute that the family regretted what they named him. They named him Augustus, and there's really nothing cute about the name Augustus or Gus. He was so cute that they decided to give him a nickname. They decided to call him Moses. Now, few of us would rank Moses in the top 5 cute names for boys. But in Dickens's day, there'd been a novel called The Vicar of Wakefield by Oliver Goldsmith that had a little boy minor character named Moses who was cute, so a lot of literate parents were nicknaming their cute kids Moses. Everybody called Dickens's a little brother Moses except for one person, Dickens's little brother. He was just starting to talk, and he couldn't say more than one syllable. So rather than calling himself Moses, he called himself Moz. But he was born with a sinus condition, and his nose was perpetually stopped up. He couldn't say M's to save his life. They all came out B's. So he called himself Boz, for Moz, for Moses, for Augustus, for Dickens's younger brother. I know you're thinking, this is what I'm missing the ACC tournament for? But it does become important in just a minute. Anyway, Dickens slaps this idiotic name Boz from his adenoidal brother on every sketch he published. And Dickens is such a genius. At 24, he actually got 36 different sketches published in 17 different magazines in 20 months. Everything Dickens sent out, they published. So was Dickens happy? No, he was disgusted. I told you they didn't pay you anything, and you couldn't use your name. Dickens was disgusted until he sweet-talked a publisher named John McCrome into bringing out Dickens's first book. You know what it is? It is a compilation of the 36 sketches that had been published, all in one book. Well, they weren't going to call it Sketches by Dickens because he wasn't Dickens yet. So, of course, they called it Sketches by Boz. This is Dickens's first book. Was it a wild success? No, I will let Dickens tell you how successful it was. Dickens wrote in a letter to his friend, "My first book, Sketches by Boz, fell stillborn from the press." It was dead-on delivery. Nobody wanted Sketches by Boz. You wanted some dumb sketches about a tree that looked like an old woman. You already had them. Most people kept their magazines. Who's going to buy 36 collected sketches by a young man who is so unknown he has to use a pseudonym? It was a disaster financially. It was the smartest thing Dickens ever did. It leads to every penny of the $68 million. Here's why. If you were a publisher like Macrome with a book like Sketches by Boz that was a dud, you could make good money on it. All you did was you took every unsold copy of Sketches by Boz and you mailed it out free to your competitors, other booksellers throughout England. You put a little note in it that says, "This is one of our hottest bestsellers, but we respect your firm so much, we want you to have a complimentary copy." Now, every bookseller knew what this meant. This meant, we can't even eat this thing. Please take it off our hands. And actually, every other bookseller, your competitor, would always take in your dud book. You know why? Because they knew one day they would have a dud book, and it turns out that the British government in 1836, when Sketches by Boz came out, they were giving booksellers who gave away unsold copy of their books to help increase literacy. The British government gave you what we would call a tax credit today for every book you gave away. So every other bookseller took in your dud because they knew when they had a dud, they'd want you to take it in so that they'd get a tax credit. So although Sketches by Boz didn't sell really much to anybody, it was on every bookseller's shelf. The bookseller would get it and think, "Oh no, not another stupid, unknown, clever kid doing sketches." And what they did, they would find a spot for it on the top shelf in the back of their bookstore because they sure weren't going to put it in a really good spot. They'd climb a ladder, put it at the very top shelf at the end where it was supposed to die a very quiet death. It would have, but that's not what happened to Sketches by Boz, because unknown even to Dickens, 6 months after Sketches by Boz came out and absolutely fizzled, the best artist in England, I mean a drawing artist, a man named Robert Seymour. You might not know Robert Seymour, I doubt you do, but in Dickens's day, Robert Seymour had the exact reputation that was enjoyed by Norman Rockwell in the 20th century. In fact, he drew cute kids on magazine covers. He was a wonderful artist. He's quite a lot like Norman Rockwell. He was the most famous artist in England. 6 months after Sketches by Boz came out, Robert Seymour, the artist, walked into a publishing house of 2 young unknown men named Mr. Chapman and Mr. Hall. Mr. Chapman and Hall were unknown, new, just starting out, probably going to go bankrupt because they had no good artists. And yet into their shop comes Robert Seymour. They recognize him because he's a world-famous artist and can't imagine, why would Robert Seymour come to them? Robert Seymour walks up to the desk and says, "Are you Mr. Chapman and Hall?" "Yes," they say. "Well," Robert Seymour says, "I've just finished a picture book. I'd like you to publish it." Well, Chapman and Hall are ecstatic. They know any book with Robert Seymour's name on the title page will be an instant bestseller and make their name. What they can't figure out is, why would someone like the great Robert Seymour, who could have had Queen Victoria's publisher had he wanted her, why would he come to these 2 young unknown publishers? What they didn't know, but we know today, thanks to scholarship, is that Robert Seymour was an alcoholic, and he was a compulsive drug user, and he was a compulsive gambler. These 3 vices had gotten him so deeply into personal debt that he actually needed 85% of the royalties on his next picture book just to break even financially. Well, Robert Seymour knew no self-respecting publisher is going to give you 85% royalty, but when he checked the names of desperate publishers, there were the names Chapman and Hall. So he said, "I've got a book. I want you to publish it. Oh, by the way, I would need 85% royalties. Is it a deal?" Well, of course, Chapman and Hall had never had 15% of anything. They thought it was generous. But before they signed, Mr. Chapman said, "Well, tell us, Mr. Seymour, what's the idea of the book?" Oh, Robert Seymour says, you're going to love it. I've invented a sports club, an athletic club, but it only has 4 fat old men in it, and they can't do sports at all. They try and shoot a bird out of the air. They're so bad they shoot someone's rear end off by mistake. They try and skate on a pond. They're so fat they fall right through. I've got 150 pictures of these fat old men. That's my idea. What do you think? Well, Chapman and Hall thought it was the stupidest thing they'd ever heard of. And they told Robert Seymour in no uncertain terms that it was brilliant. They didn't care what it was. With Robert Seymour's name on the page, they were going to make a fortune. It is at this point that Robert Seymour says the words that changed the history of literature. He said, "You know, if we wrote funny captions underneath my funny pictures of these 4 fat men, we'd have a joke book, not just a picture book, and we could charge double." He said, "Do you happen to know any young, unknown, second banana, clever kid who could write funny captions underneath my funny pictures? If you do, I'll sign with you now." Well, Chapman and Hall didn't know anybody. That's why they were in trouble. But Mr. Hall tells us later he was not going to tell him the truth, that they didn't know of any clever young man, and lose him. But clearly, they had to give him some kind of a name, and they didn't know anybody. So according to Mr. Hall, out of desperation on the spot, he prayed to God to give him a name they could give Robert Seymour. And he said, as his eyes went up to heaven to pray, they passed the back bookshelf, and there on the top shelf in a bright red binding he saw Sketches by Boz, and he remembered that was some clever kid that they'd thrown up there. So he looked at Robert Seymour, lied through his teeth, and said, "Oh yes, we are intimately connected with a delightful young man, but we do need a week to get back in touch with our dear friend," which of course meant we need a week to figure out who in the world this person is. Robert Seymour said, "I'm in no hurry. Let's meet in a week." And he left. As soon as he left, Hall says they put up the ladder, got down Sketches by Boz, looked at every page, but as I told you, they couldn't find an author's name. You couldn't use an author's name. No name at all. So the joke goes that for the next week, Chapman and Hall ran all over London saying, "Who the Dickens is Boz?" Now, I have lost respect for you as an audience. You laugh at that, you'll laugh at anything. But supposedly it's true. Finally, Chapman and Hall, though not geniuses, figured if we pay money to John McCrome, because his name was listed as publisher, he might give away the name. They go to John McCrome, who takes the money and says, "Well, yes, Boz is this unknown writer, Charles Dickens." Literary history is made on February 11th, 1836, when Chapman, Hall, Robert Seymour, and Dickens meet to sign the deal for the joke book. They meet at Dickens's flat because Dickens wrongly figured that Chapman and Hall were big-name publishers because they had the great Robert Seymour, and Dickens wasn't known yet, so he wanted them on his turf. He had them over Sunday night for dessert, and then the first thing they say when Chapman, Hall, and Seymour walk in the door, Dickens says, "Well, tell me, Mr. Seymour, what's your idea for our book?" "Oh, you're going to love it," Seymour says. Goes through the fat men shooting off people's rear ends. They assume Dickens is going to say, "Isn't that wonderful? Where do I sign?" Because he's going to be working with Seymour. They didn't know Charles Dickens. Even at 23 and a half, Dickens would never work on any project where he didn't have control. He listens to the idea, and rather than saying, "How delightful, where do I sign?" he said, "Could I have 5 minutes alone in my study to consider this proposition?" "Sure," they said, "go ahead." So as Dickens tells us, he walked into his closet, because he didn't have a study at that flat. But according to Dickens, he went in the closet, wrote for 5 minutes, came out, and gave a list of 5 demands, 5 ultimata to Chapman and Hall, and actually said, "You meet these demands, or I'm not interested." Well, of course, you would think they would say, who do you think you are, Dickens? I mean, they could have found writers who would have paid for the privilege of working with the great Robert Seymour. Here is this unknown young man, Dickens, telling him, meet my demands or leave. But lucky for us, Chapman and Hall looked over Dickens's demands, and one idea, one ultimatum was so brilliant in its conception, they knew who the genius was, and it wasn't Robert Seymour. What had Dickens come up with that changes literature? Simply this. He said, well, you know, people don't want joke books today. They want novels. Let's take your dumb idea of the four men in the club, and we make it a novel. I write the novel. You illustrate it, Seymour. Well, this didn't impress anybody. They figured Dickens just wanted more of the action. But then Dickens said, how much were we going to charge for that joke book? Oh, Robert Seymour said, with my name on the cover, Dickens, we could get $20 a copy. Now, he didn't say dollars, he used pounds, so I'm translating. In today's money, Seymour was saying with his joke book, they'd get $20. And Dickens said, no, we're going to charge $200 for the novel. And of course, Chapman and Hall said, are you insane? Nobody's paid $30 for Sir Walter Scott. Nobody will pay $200 a copy for this novel. Dickens said, not only can I guarantee they'll pay the $200, but once they bought the book, they won't know they spent the money. What, says Chapman and Hall? We're going to publish your novel for $200, people buy it, and then they don't know they've paid it? Impossible. No, Dickens said, because we're not going to bring out this novel like a novel. And they all three said in unison, how do you bring out a novel not like a novel? Simple, Dickens said, we'll bring out my novel once a month, 3 chapters at a time. They went, what? Dickens said, look, make people come to the bookstore in January. Make them give us a shilling. Now, a shilling wasn't worth all that much even back in Dickens's day. They give us a shilling, and you know what they get? Chapter 1, 2, and 3 of the novel. Dickens said, but wow, that means they'll have to come back in February. Put down more money. Get chapter 4, 5, and 6. Wait a minute, Dickens said. That means they'll have to come back in March. Put down more money. Get chapter 7, 8, and 9. And Dickens said, and I must quote him directly here, quote, I'm going to make this novel so god-awful long they'll be buying it for 2 years. We finally give them all the novel. They finally give us all their money. It was Mr. Chapman who said, forget it, Dickens, that idea will never work. Why not, said Dickens. Because, he said, you're not a bookseller. You don't know, Dickens, it costs us a minimum of 3 shillings a copy to produce any book. Even this once a month, 3 chapter at a time thing you've dreamed up, it costs us 3 shillings a copy. You just helpfully said to sell it for 1 shilling. We will certainly know when we sell your book because we lose 2 shillings a copy. No, Dickens said, I've done my homework. I have a way we can make a fat profit on 1 shilling. Now, when I give this lecture to my students, I always pause here and point out Charles Dickens always did his homework, and he earned $68 million. I don't know why I bother, goes right over their heads. Anyway, Dickens said, here's how we make the money. Remember that they are at his flat? He walked over to his bookcase, he picked up a book, any book would have done, and he said, now isn't it a fact, Mr. Chapman, since you're a book publisher, when you publish a book, it doesn't matter if the book has 70 pages or 700 pages, you never determine the price of the book by how long it is? And Chapman says, well, yes, Dickens, as you probably know, pages are made out of cheap paper pulp. They cost us almost nothing, so it doesn't matter how big the book is, we never determine the price because of the pages, but so what? Dickens said, well, then isn't it true when someone buys a book, what they buy is the front cover and the back cover and the spine, because those aren't made out of cheap paper pulp, are they? Aren't they made out of wood? Isn't wood expensive? Doesn't it determine the price of the book? Yes, Chapman said, but so what? Dickens said, well, how come every book ever published has all this expensive wood in the covers, driving up the cost, giving the public really nothing? Couldn't we invent a new kind of book that has the covers made out of the same thing as the pages, cheap paper pulp. Dickens said the front cover could be paper pulp, the back cover could be paper pulp. Dickens said you could call it paperback. That had a nice ring to it. Dickens does invent the first mass-market paperback book for an original novel when he's 23 and a half. Well, Chapman said, we'll still go bankrupt. Why, said Dickens. Yes, Chapman said, if we invent this thing you call a paperback, we could make a profit on 1 shilling. And yes, everybody will come in January, give us their money, we'll be doing well. Maybe next month half the people are still reading, they'll come, give us more money. Who knows, in March, maybe half of those people still are reading your novel, they give us more money. But he said, don't kid yourself, Dickens. Nobody in his or her right mind is going to come back for 18 months in a row and keep giving us money for the next chapters. He said, here's what's going to happen to your novel, Dickens. People will start reading it, and then they'll start getting bored, and then they'll quit reading it, and then they'll quit buying the next installment. But we, the publishers, have to publish the stupid thing, obviously, till it's finished. Nobody buys the last half. We go bankrupt. Dickens said, I don't care if I let my novel go on 5 years, 60 months, 180 chapters. I guarantee they will be throwing money at us more eagerly at the end than they did at the beginning, because, Dickens said, I'll just make sure that at the end of each monthly installment, at the end of chapter 3 and 6 and 9 and 12 and 15 and 18, on the last page, in the last paragraph, something incredible will happen. The publisher said, well, like what? Dickens said, well, how's this? Let's say in one of my novels at the end of chapter 3, we have my hero start walking up a really steep cliff. But there'll be a huge root growing out of that cliff. My hero will be absent-minded. He will trip over the root. He will fall completely off the cliff at the end of chapter 3. But, Dickens said, I'll be sure that my hero has forgotten to cut his fingernails for 5 years. They'll be incredibly long. As he trips off the cliff, he will look at his fingernails and get a really good idea. With his last ounce of energy before he plummets, he will lurch himself back to the edge of the cliff, and in the second to the last sentence of chapter 3, I'll have him hanging at that cliff by his nails alone. And Dickens said, that's not all. What about this? In the last sentence of chapter 3, I'll have somebody else start walking up that same old cliff. But the reader won't know, is that somebody, the hero's friend, who will carefully pick him up and save him? Or is it the villain who will stamp on his knuckles and send him crashing to his death below in the ocean? And Dickens said, you know how people can find out who's coming up the cliff? No, said the publisher. How? Simple. Put down your money in February and buy chapter 4, 5, 6. In that flash second of inspiration, when Dickens was not yet 24, he not only came up with the way that all of his novels first came out. He never once published a novel as a novel first. He published it once a month, 3 chapters at a time. But as I need not tell you, Dickens also just happened to invent General Hospital, The Young and the Restless, The Bold and the Beautiful, all of daytime TV but the talk shows. Dickens invents the soap opera in 1836. He is the first human being to come up with the principle. Now, he didn't name it soap opera. He had a much better name. Dickens named it procrastinated suspense. And that is the same thing it still is today. Well, Chapman, Hall, and Seymour said, you're a genius. This thing's going to make a fortune. Let's get started. What should we call it? Dickens said, well, I was thinking about that old Fat Man Club. I thought we'd call the club the Pickwick Club. Great, they said, we'll call the novel the Pickwick Club. No, Dickens said, you haven't been listening. This is the first paperback of all time. We need to call it the Pickwick Papers. And they did. Was it a success? Well, it was the best-selling novel of 1836. And, of course, thanks to the way Dickens brought it out, it was the best-selling novel of 1837 because it was still coming out in 1837. In 1900, they did a survey, the best-selling novel of the entire 19th century, Pickwick. And you think you know why? Because I have just taught you in that one novel, he not only invented the soap opera and the paperback and the cliffhanger, and that is not why it sold so well. It is what Dickens came up with once the novel started coming out that made it the best-selling novel of all time. Here's what happened. People suddenly, for the first time, had to go to the bookstore every month to get the first 3 chapters of a new novel. Well, they were paying a shilling, didn't bother them, and what did they have to show after 18 months of buying Pickwick? They had a big pile of trash because Dickens made sure the paper that Pickwick was printed on was of such poor quality to get more profit, it fell apart if you read it too hard. It was cheap junk paper, but nobody cared. They were just paying a shilling. But what bothered people was when they finished the novel. When you finished a novel in 1836 that you loved and everybody thought Pickwick was the funniest book they'd ever read, do you know what you did with your novel? I'll tell you what you did. You had a room in your house with mahogany shelves that was called the library. Do you realize the first public library was 1892? This is 1836. 50 years earlier, there were no libraries except in your house. You had a book you loved like Pickwick, you put it proudly on one of your library shelves for your family and friends to gawk at. But now you had a problem you'd never had before. You tried to put that cheap junk paper Pickwick in between your leather-bound Ivanhoe and Pride and Prejudice. Well, of course, the whole thing looked awful. What were you going to do? Well, Charles Dickens, with his big heart, came to the rescue. In September of 1837, when the last 3 chapters of Pickwick finally came off, everybody runs to the bookstore to get the last 3 chapters, because you know how Dickens ties things all together at the end. Everybody runs to the bookstore to buy the last 3 chapters, but as they're leaving the bookstore with the last paperback of Pickwick, they notice on the other side of the bookseller's shop, piled high to the ceiling, were leather-bound, gilt-edged, silk ribbon-markered editions of the Pickwick Papers in hardback. People picked it up and said, "Wow, wouldn't that look great in my library?" Everybody bought the hardback so they'd have a display copy. What does this tell us? Well, it tells us that Dickens is the only author I think you'll ever know who sold the same book to the same people twice. They had to buy it in parts. They couldn't wait to hear what happened next. Then they had to buy the hardback. But we're not finished. If you ever wondered, how did Dickens invent something as greedy as Ebenezer Scrooge? Listen very carefully. Once the hardback came out, Dickens had his ultimate greedy commercial thought. And it was this. He thought, now that they've bought the hardback of Pickwick, what are they going to do with the cheap paperback? Well, he knew they were going to dump them. Why would you keep the paperback when you had the beautiful hardback to display? Nobody dumped the paperback because 2 weeks after Dickens's Pickwick came out in hardback, salesmen were sent to your door. They would knock and say, "Have you bought the display hardback copy of Pickwick?" And you'd say, "Well, yes, I'm not buying another one from you." "Oh, no," the salesman was trained to say, "I don't want to sell you anything." And then, as an almost afterthought, he said, "By the way, what are you doing with the cheap 3-chapter parts of Pickwick that you'd read for 2 years?" "Oh," you'd say, "I'm dumping those. I've got the beautiful hardback." "Oh, no," the salesman said, "don't throw them away. May I buy back every installment of Pickwick you'd bought for 18 months? Now, they paid you almost nothing for the whole set, but what did you care? You were going to dump them. You had the hardback. Why would Dickens's publisher buy back every 3-chapter part of Pickwick in paper? Here's why. They bought them all back, and then they ripped off the front and the back cover of every installment. That gave them 3 chapters of Pickwick. They put them together in chronological order, but this time they sewed them into a beautiful leatherback book that had a 12-karat gold banding around the edge, and it was actually sold as the collector's edition of Charles Dickens's Pickwick, and it was advertised, printed on the original paper when this world-famous novel first came out. Now, I know you're thinking, well, who would be dumb enough to buy the collector's edition, which was hideously expensive? They'd bought it in parts. They had it in the house. Who would want it? You would be wrong. Anybody who could get all that money together fast, who could buy the collector's edition, immediately bought it, but of course didn't take it home. You didn't need it at home. You had the copy in the library. What did people do with the collector's edition? You immediately took it to your bank and you put it in your safety deposit box, because you now did have the original paper of the greatest selling novel of all time. If you let it rest in that safety deposit box, you made a fortune. It was a work of art, and it made more money more quickly than any stock ever could. It was an incredible investment, so everybody who could buy the collector's edition bought it for investment purposes. So what does this tell us? Well, I think it tells us that Dickens is the only writer you'll ever study who sold the same book to the same people 3 times each. Once in parts, once in hardback, bought back the parts, ripped off the front cover, ripped off the back cover, ripped you off at an enormous price that you were willing to give him because you wanted the investment. It was a money-making scheme like no other, and Charles Dickens is 24 and a half. People came up to him on the street and would say, "Mr. Dickens, I have never laughed so hard over any book as I've laughed over Pickwick Papers. Do you think you might one day write a second novel?" Dickens said, "You know, the first day of next month, be at the bookstore. My next novel's coming out." "Really?" people said. "What are you calling your second novel?" Dickens said, "Well, actually, I've named it Oliver Twist." And people thought, Oliver Twist, that's the silliest name I've ever heard for a hero of any book. This thing's going to be funnier than Pickwick. So everybody runs out in October to buy the first 3 chapters of Oliver and get a really good belly laugh. And if you've read it, you may remember what they find in chapter 1. A beautiful woman, obviously from high birth, very pregnant, but no wedding ring. And what does she do to amuse herself? She's crawling to a workhouse in a terrible thunderstorm. And what happens at the end of chapter 1? This woman drops dead, giving birth to this instant little orphan, Oliver Twist. And everybody's reading it and thinking, gosh, Dickens, we're off to a slow start this time. They get into chapter 2. Little Oliver's apprenticed to a coffin maker, has to move dead legs, crawl in, go to sleep. In chapter 3, little Oliver is so ill-fed at the workhouse that he has to utter what has become the 3rd most recognizable line in all British fiction. As I know many of you know, he has Oliver say, "Please, sir, I want some more." It is the 3rd most recognizable line in all British fiction. Now, in case you're curious and you're thinking, I wonder what the 2nd most recognized line is in all British fiction, I can tell you. It goes, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." Opening lines, Tale of Two Cities. And of course, if you're insatiably curious and you will not leave this room even to turn on the TV and see who's ahead until I tell you the single most famous line, you wonder, where does he come up with this? There have been surveys. Scholastic Scope, for one, a magazine for young people, put 100 of the most famous lines in British fiction on a sheet. The top 3 are always, number 3, "Please, sir, I want some more." Number 2 is always, "It was the best of times, worst of times." The single most famous line, more recognized by more people than any other line in British fiction. I can't help you on this one. I know it. I don't know who wrote it. It goes, "God bless us, everyone." Watch for it at Christmas time. Dickens has the top 3 lines, and the poor man dropped dead at 58. Had he lived a normal life, he'd have all 10 in a row. Anyway, people keep reading Oliver Twist. They can't wait to buy the next installment to see how the little boy's going to get beat up next and survive. They finish Oliver Twist. They see Dickens in the street. Dickens must have been walking in the street a lot in these days. And they come up to him and say, "Mr. Dickens, I have never cried so hard over any book as I did over your Oliver Twist." And Dickens, who is not old but also not modest, would say, "I made you laugh harder than you've ever laughed in my first novel. I made you cry harder than you've ever cried in my second. I've run the gamut of human emotions in my first 2 novels. They're both instant world bestsellers, and I'm 25, and it is all true. But if you think Pickwick changed the history of literature by inventing the soap opera and the paperback, it is nothing to what Oliver Twist did. Get ready to be impressed. Oliver Twist is the first book ever written, not just the first novel, the first book that has a child as a central character. There had never been a child in literature before that had a central role. Dickens is the first to bring the child smack dab in the middle of literature. There is no example before at all. Now, why is this important to us, let's say, as Americans? Well, Mark Twain came 50 years later. He is immortal because of Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer, Becky Thatcher. There could be no Twain. Twain simply stole what Dickens invented not 40 years before and made it central in his books and made him immortal too. But the thing, if you've read most of Dickens, you know about Dickens, he not only put the child for the first time in literature, he specialized. The only kind of children he ever gives you, 3 types. He either gives you a sick child, a mistreated child, or sadly, his all-time favorite, a dying child. There was a PhD candidate at the University of Wisconsin who did her doctoral thesis on children in Dickens's novels. Let me quote for you her conclusion. Quote, "If you are a child born into a novel by Charles Dickens, your life expectancy is 8. That's it. You're not going to see your 9th birthday. Kids are dropping off right and left in Dickens because, of course, he's trying to make a wonderful social point. And Christmas Carol is the best of all. He can actually kill off Tiny Tim in one version and bring him back a few chapters later. The ultimate, kill off the kid, bring him back. It was a brilliant technique. It made the lives of children in Victorian England so much better, and it certainly made Dickens' life a lot better too. Now, I have just told you what Charles Dickens did when he was 24, 25, and 26. But if you can believe it, the most fascinating things that ever happened to him happened when he was 27, 28, and 29. But it's 10 of 8. My 50 minutes are gone, so I guess if you'd want to know what happened to Charles Dickens next, you'd have to have me back for the same fee for the second installment. No, actually, he couldn't top 24, 25, and 26, but I do think 50 minutes is enough of anybody's life for an after-dinner speech. I will conclude as I conclude all my talks. You heard Martha say very kindly at the beginning that I do raise money for Dickens because I am president of the Dickens Fellowship. She mentioned that Dickens helped found the first children's hospital on earth, the Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital. Maybe that doesn't mean anything to you, but I am hoping that most of you tuned in to the opening ceremonies of the London Olympics this past summer. If you watched the opening ceremonies, you remember that tableau of all English history it opened with? I am hoping you remember there was a scene when all these adorable little children are jumping up and down on hospital beds with the nurses next to them. Behind that scene was a sign that looked like it said GOSH, G-O-S-H. That stood for Great Ormond Street Hospital. They spent more time on that scene than anything else in British history. I have never been more proud to raise money for the Great Ormond Street Hospital than I was seeing it at the Olympics. What the Dickens Fellowship does, they sell an item, you buy it, the profit goes to the hospital. What a coincidence! Here's an item right here you could buy. It's a CD of a lecture by Dr. Engel called The Dickens Nobody Knows. The very lecture you heard tonight. If you were sitting there thinking, oh, if only Martha could have heard that lecture. Well, Martha can hear it. Here it is. What a nice, inexpensive Christmas or birthday gift for Martha, which she can't return because I have inscribed every copy. I've written cheers in my name, but I've got my pen. We'll write her name in somebody else's name. We don't take it back. Once there's a name in it, they'll never know how little you paid. So I do have it. It is the exact Now, I was going to say it's the exact lecture I gave tonight, but I do want to be invited back, and I'm not going to lie to you. What's on the CD is not the exact lecture I gave tonight, and that is because I don't know why I got nervous tonight. I left out the best 5 minutes of my Dickens talk, but they are on the CD. My, didn't that work out well for everybody? Now, this is hard for me. I'm basically a shy scholar, but for a good cause I come out. But I'm looking at my audience. You know this is a Rockingham County Reads group. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, I don't come to a lecture at a community college because I'm into CDs. I'm here, of course, because I love books. What luck, they're selling 2 items. Yes, you may decide on the CD, but as Martha pointed out earlier, my latest gift book for the public, the Dickens Fellowship said, write something everybody would want to read. I thought, well, and then it hit me. As an English professor, I have read more brilliant short stories and poems where the main character was either a cat or a dog. And I thought, why not bring out an anthology of literature of the greatest writers? I mean, Dickens opens this thing up. There's O. Henry. There's Emily Dickinson. The greatest writers have written short stories, stories, or poems that star either a cat or a dog. Put them all together. You can guess how many chapters our book has. 16. 9 chapters are for the 9 lives of cats, and 7 chapters are for that sad 7-to-1 ratio of cats' years to ours. 16 chapters, and as Martha mentioned, I called it Raining Cats and Dogs because cats rule our lives. I spelled it R-E-I. This is too cute for words. Raining Cats and Dogs. It is wonderful cat and dog stories. I do some very humorous introductions, but the Dickens Fellowship said, no, that's not enough. People have to have a recipe book. Make a recipe book in the back that has the same theme. And I said, you mean we have to find recipes that use a cat or a dog? No, they said. Now, the Dickens Fellowship are pet lovers. So instead, this is the only recipe book you will ever have that has more recipes for hush puppies. Here is chicken cacciatore, but my favorite, we've got a recipe for a Mexican stew called Ay Chihuahua Chili, which is sensational. So you get the book. There's no depth we won't stoop to sell for the hospital. You get the book, you get the stories, you get the recipe. I've inscribed every copy. I wrote best wishes and my name, and I meant it. This is a new book. I sold it for the first time last year. The first place I sold it was Pasadena, California, and I'm not making this up. I can't tell you how many people came up afterwards, bought a book, and said, would you put 2 Fido from your master? 2 Whiskers from your mistress? I had a young lady come up and she said, would you inscribe it 2 Solomon from your mistress? So I had to ask, I said, is Solomon a little cat or a dog? And she said, oh, no, I've never had a pet, so we quit right there. But my point is, I don't care who you want it for. It goes to the hospital. It is a good cause. So should you want a book or should you want a CD? I have them both here. Now, the sad thing, I hate to tell you this, but it is true. I was only able to bring 400 copies of the book, so it's going to be first. I don't want just a mob scene over there. Anyway, should you want a book or a CD, the Dickens Fellowship sells everything for the same price. It's $18.50 for either. The tax is $150. Now, just a minute. I'm not good at math. $18.50. Gosh, that's an even $20. If you brought cash, do I ever have change? If you brought a check, you make it to Dickens Club. It goes right to the charity. We would love to take credit cards, but it's a British charity, and they won't take our credit cards. So it is cash or credit card. As I said, $20 for either. But more importantly, if you want to buy a book or a CD, we'd love that. But if you have a question about Dickens, usually there's a question and answer period. And let's face it, maybe 10% of the people are fascinated by the question asked. The other 90% want to know the score of the game tonight. So I'm going to do a one-on-one. If you have a question about Dickens, I'm here anyway to sign books and CDs. I'll be right over at that table right next to the refreshments. I'd be delighted to answer a Dickens question or to sell you a book or a CD for the hospital. You have been a superb audience, and I mean that. Thank you very much.